Before we begin, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Whether you're sitting on a porch in Tennessee, wrapped in a quilt out in Montana, or maybe somewhere cold with a hot cup of coffee in your hands, I want to know. Every single comment matters to me. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story. We put out new videos every single week, and every one of them is the kind of story that stays with you long after it ends. Now, let's talk about a woman named Cecelia Wainwright. In the morning, she climbed onto a westbound train, knowing she was the last name on the list, knowing two women had already said no, knowing she was nobody's first choice, and choosing to go anyway. The rejection notices came in small envelopes. Cecelia Wainwright had learned to recognize them by the weight. They were light no more than a single folded page inside, and they arrived at irregular intervals, sometimes two in the same week, sometimes with a month or more of silence in between. She kept them in a small tin box she stored under her bed. She didn't read them again after the first time. She simply kept them the way some people keep evidence of things they had survived. By the time she turned 36 in the spring of 1883, there were 9 of them. 9 letters informing her in the careful, apologetic language of a St. Louis placement agency that a prospective gentleman had reviewed her particulars and decided to pursue another match. She was 36 years old, broad in the shoulder, sturdy through the middle. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had never been idle, rough-knuckled, flour-dusted, calloused from years of hauling wood and kneading dough and wringing laundry in cold water before the sun came up. Her face was plain, not unkind, not frightening, just plain. The kind of face men look past without thinking twice, the way they look past a fence post or a grain elevator or anything that was simply there and didn't ask to be noticed. She had been called too much woman once by a man in Hayes who had paid her some attention for exactly 2 weeks before losing interest. She had heard every variation of the same assessment enough times that it had stopped surprising her by the time she was 28. Too much, too plain, too old, too wide, too practical. Not enough of the right things. She had stopped counting rejections at around 28 and started doing something harder. She had started hoping in a quieter, more practical way. The kind of hoping that didn't require another person to agree with you. All she wanted was to be needed. Not loved, she had talked herself out of that particular dream a long time ago. But needed, useful, part of something that mattered. She had not found that yet. But the 9th rejection notice had arrived on a Tuesday, and the 10th envelope from the agency, which had come 3 days later, and which was heavier than the rest, had not been a rejection at all. She had first heard about mail order listings from Dorothea, a widow from her church in Hayes, who had answered such a listing 3 years prior and ended up in Colorado with a farmer named Peabody. "It's not romantic," Dorothea had told her, stirring her tea with the same efficiency she applied to everything. "But it's a life, and some of us are better suited to building something solid than to waiting for something sweet." Cecelia had turned that sentence over for most of a year before she'd done anything about it. She was living alone by then. Her mother had passed in April after a long illness, and the house in Hayes, which had been her mother's house and her grandmother's, before that now belonged to her brother Elliot by the terms of the will, which had not bothered Cecelia so much as the way Elliot had told her. Not cruelly, just efficiently, the way a man delivers information he expects to be received without complication. There wasn't much room, he'd said. Not with Agnes and the children. She'd understand. She understood. She was 35 years old, and she had spent the last 4 years of her life caring for a dying woman and managing a household that was never really hers. And now it was time to find somewhere else to be. She had written to the St. Louis agency in May. She had filled out her particulars honestly. All of them. Age 35, weight substantial, height 5'4", skills cooking, preserving, baking, household management, livestock, feeding, basic carpentry repair, education adequate, health excellent, temperament steady, disposition practical. She had not tried to make herself sound like something she wasn't. She had spent most of her life being told she wasn't enough of the right things, and she had decided somewhere along the way that she was done pretending otherwise. Whoever wanted what she actually was would get it honestly. The responses had been sparse. Most men were looking for a woman between 20 and 28, slim if possible, pretty if they were being direct about it, young enough to bear children. Cecelia was none of those things, and the agency had been kind, but clear her listing had not drawn significant interest. She had been passed over 9 times. The 10th letter was different. A Mr. Harlan Greer of Caldwell County, Wyoming Territory was seeking a capable woman to serve as wife and household manager on his cattle ranch. He was 52 years of age, a widower, no children. He owned a substantial property known as the Double G Ranch, some 12,000 acres south of Laramie. He was not the notice made clear looking for romance. He was looking for reliability, someone who could manage a household, oversee kitchen operations, and maintain the domestic functions of a large working property. It was the most practical marriage proposal Cecelia had ever read, and she had read several by now. She sat with it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she wrote back and said she was interested. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived not from the agency but from Harlan Greer himself. It was short, fewer than 10 lines. He told her the train fare would be provided. He told her she would have a room of her own. He told her the wedding would take place within a week of her arrival before a justice of the peace and that there would be no fuss about it. He did not tell her she was his first choice. She already suspected she wasn't. The morning she left Hayes, her sister-in-law Mildred walked her to the station. It was early June, cool enough to need a shawl, the sun not yet fully up. Mildred was a small, precise woman who had never quite warmed to Cecelia, but she was the only one who showed up, and Cecelia counted that as kindness, regardless of motive. They stood on the platform together while the station master called times, and Mildred was quiet for a while in the way that people are quiet when they're working up to saying something. "I heard Mr. Greer had 2 other women turn him down," Mildred said finally. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She just wasn't trying not to be either. Cecelia set her travel bag down. "Did you?" "A woman in my sewing circle, her cousin is with the St. Louis agency. She said there was some trouble with the ranch, financial trouble. Both women were matched and both declined when they found out the particulars." Mildred pulled her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "I thought you should know is all." Cecelia looked down the track at the empty rails stretching west. The light was beginning to come up over the flat Kansas horizon, turning the sky the particular pale gold that she had always found beautiful in a way she'd never quite been able to articulate to anyone. She had known she wasn't the first choice. She hadn't quite known how clearly, how definitively she was the last. She picked up her bag. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She meant it. She had always preferred to know things clearly, especially when they were unpleasant. Clarity was something you could work with. Illusions were not. She boarded the train. She found her seat by the window, set her small trunk in the rack above, and folded her hands in her lap. The train gave a long, slow shudder and began to move. Outside the glass, Hayes, Kansas slid away behind her, the grain elevators, the brown yards, the dusty main street she had walked 1,000 times. She watched it go without sentiment. She thought about Mildred's words. 2 women had been offered this life and had said no. She was the one who had said yes. She turned the question over quietly in her mind, the way she turned over practical problems, without drama, without agitation, looking at it from different angles. Why had they said no? Because the ranch was failing. Because the man was old and remote and offered no romance. Because they had better options, or believed they did. She did not have better options. She had exactly this one. That was the simple truth of it. But she had also, over the course of a difficult few years, learned something about what it meant to be useful. She had kept her mother alive longer than the doctor had expected. She had kept a household running on money that wasn't enough. She had coaxed warmth from fires that wanted to go out, and meals from pantries that were almost empty, and dignity from situations that didn't naturally offer any. She knew how to hold things together when they were coming apart. That was not nothing. That was in fact a specific and hard-won skill, and she was bringing it with her. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window, closed her eyes, and let the train carry her west. The trip from Hayes to Laramie took the better part of 2 days, with a change in Denver and a long overnight on a car that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. She slept in short intervals, woke stiff each time, and ate the food she'd packed: 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, a wedge of hard cheese and apple, a small tin of sardines she'd thought of at the last moment. She watched the land change outside the window, Kansas flat, then the Great Plains beginning to corrugate as they approached the mountains, then the startling white peaks of Colorado, coming up on the western horizon, then the long descent into Wyoming's wide-open spaces where the sky was bigger than anything Kansas had offered, and the land had a spare, uncompromising quality she hadn't expected. She found it beautiful. She hadn't expected that either. By the time the train rolled into Laramie in the early afternoon, she was tired and travel-worn and very hungry. But she stepped onto the platform with her back straight and her trunk in hand and looked around the way a woman looks around when she is arriving somewhere she intends to stay. A man was waiting near the far end of the platform. He was leaning against a post with his arms folded, watching the passengers disembark with an expression that was not unfriendly exactly, but wasn't warm either. Watchful, measuring the expression of a man accustomed to evaluating practical things. Horses, weather, fences. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and broad, with the kind of build that suggested decades of physical labor, rather than any particular vanity about the result. His hair was dark with a great deal of silver in it. His face was deeply lined, weathered to a particular roughness that spoke of a life spent almost entirely out of doors. He wore a working man's clothes, nothing fancy, nothing trying to impress. His boots were muddy at the heel. She walked toward him. He straightened when he saw her coming. His eyes moved over her, not rudely, not the way men sometimes looked at women, as though cataloging deficiencies, but with the frank, practical assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating what was in front of him. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Greer," she said, "Miss Wainwright." He nodded, not a bow, just a nod, direct and without ceremony. Train was on time. It was. He picked up her trunk one-handed without commentary and turned toward the street. She followed him. A wagon waited at the edge of the station yard, hitched to a pair of heavy brown horses that looked steady and well-kept. She noted that with approval. A man who kept his horses well usually kept other things well too, in her experience. He helped her up onto the seat without ceremony. She was already halfway up on her own, and he arrived just in time to offer a steadying hand as she made the last step, which she accepted without comment. He climbed up the other side, took the reins, and clicked to the horses. They moved. They drove in silence for several minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence. Both of them seemed, she thought, to be the kind of people who didn't feel compelled to fill silence with words. The town of Laramie passed around them and fell behind, and the road opened up into the wide Wyoming landscape. Brown grass, still patchy from the winter, the mountains visible to the west, the sky enormous and pale blue, and scattered with high, thin clouds. Finally, he said, "I should tell you, the ranch has seen better years." She looked at him. Meaning what exactly? He kept his eyes on the road. His jaw worked once, as though he was deciding how much honesty was appropriate for this particular moment. Meaning it's not what it was 5 years ago. You'll find things different than you might have expected. Different how? Fewer hands. Kitchen's not been properly stocked in months. House needs work. A pause. I'm not in a position to pretend otherwise. Cecelia absorbed this information the way she absorbed most information, quietly, without reaction, filing it away for practical consideration. "And the 2 women before me," she said, keeping her voice level, "is that why they didn't come?" The silence that followed was a long one. The wheels rolled over rutted ground. A hawk was circling something far out in the grass, patient and unhurried. "Yes," he said finally, just the word, "Banden." No embellishment. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. He glanced at hers, then a quick, sharp look, the first real look he had given her since she'd stepped off the train. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just slightly. "All right," he repeated. He sounded, she thought, almost uncertain, as though he had expected a different response and didn't quite know what to do with this one. "I didn't come expecting paradise, Mr. Greer. I came expecting work." She folded her hands in her lap. "Show me what needs doing and I'll get to it." He looked at the road again. Something in the set of his shoulders changed very slightly, barely perceptible. Like a man who has been holding something taut and has eased his grip a fraction. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The Double G Ranch appeared in the late afternoon light, and Cecilia's first impression was of something large and faded, like a piece of furniture that had once been beautiful, but had been left too long in poor weather. The main house was substantial, 2 stories wide, wraparound porch, solid bones, she could see, even at a distance. The kind of construction that required real money and real intention. but the porch railing sagged in two places. One of the upstairs shutters hung at a broken angle, its paint peeling in long strips. The kitchen garden along the south side of the house was overgrown and untended, winter weeds coming in strong, the remnants of last summer's planting still visible beneath them like bones. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a smaller structure she couldn't identify from a distance. All of them bore the same look, built well, once maintained unevenly since. The double G, had she understood, immediately been a fine operation at some point not too long ago. The bones were good. The neglect was real, but it was the neglect of difficulty, not of character. There was a difference, and she could read it. There were men in the yard, three of them doing end-of-day work with the slow efficiency of the very tired. They looked up when the wagon came in, then looked away again with what she recognized as the particular incuriosity of men who had learned not to expect good news and had decided to invest their energy elsewhere. Harlan pulled the wagon to a stop. He climbed down and came around to help her. She was already halfway down on her own, and he arrived just in time to catch her elbow as she made the last step. She steadied, nodded her thanks. He released her arm. "I'll show you the house," he said. The inside was better than the outside and worse than she'd hoped. The main room's parlor sitting room. The wide entry hall had the look of a place that had once been tended with real care and was now simply managed for basic survival. The furniture was good quality, but dusty. The floors needed sweeping. The windows were filmed with the particular gray haze of windows that hadn't been washed in months. The whole house carried a faint smell of old smoke and absence, the particular smell of rooms that weren't being properly lived in, that had been abandoned to function without care. Harlan showed her to a bedroom on the ground floor behind the kitchen. Small, but private. A window looking out over the kitchen yard. A narrow bed with a clean quilt. A washstand with a pitcher and basin. "I had Margaret, she comes in from town twice a week, air it out and make it up," he said. He stood in the doorway, not coming in, one hand on the doorframe. "It's fine," Cecelia said. She set her bag down. She looked around the room with the quick, comprehensive assessment of a woman taking inventory. "Where's the kitchen?" He blinked, as though he had expected something different. "Through there." He gestured at the connecting door. She went through it. The kitchen was large, designed for a working ranch house that fed hired hands and family together back when there were enough of both to fill it. It had a good iron range, heavy and solid, a wide work table in the center, two deep sinks, a pantry off to one side with a door that stood slightly ajar. She opened the pantry door all the way. What she found told her most of what she needed to know. 2 sacks of flour, one nearly empty, a small barrel of cornmeal, some dried beans in a jar, a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth that had seen better days going gray at the edges, 4 unlabeled tins, a jar of salt nearly full, a few dried peppers hanging from a string, some sad-looking dried herbs she'd have to evaluate more carefully. Not much else. Enough for a few days if you were careful, not enough to feed 4 men 3 meals a day over the long term. She stood in the pantry for a long moment. She was not panicking, she was calculating. She came back out and stood at the work table. "When do the men expect supper?" she asked. Harlan was in the kitchen doorway, watching her with that same watchful expression. "Around 6. She looked at the range. The fire had gone cold. "I'll need the fire built up, and I'll need someone to show me where the water pump is." "East side of the house." "Root cellar?" "Below the barn." "Any eggs?" "Should be. Chickens are still laying." "Good." She pulled her apron from her bag. She had packed it at the very top, knowing she'd need it within the first hour, and tied it on. "I'll see what I can do." He watched her for a moment with that expression that she would come to understand in time was his version of something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the look of a man encountering something that didn't fit his existing categories and wasn't sure yet what to do about that. "I'll get someone to build up the fire," he said. She was already back in the pantry assessing. She didn't hear him leave, but when she turned around, he was gone. She stood alone in the cold kitchen of a failing Wyoming ranch with a near-empty pantry and 4 hungry men to feed before dark, and she felt not despair, not even worry, but something much closer to clarity. She knew exactly what she was dealing with. She knew exactly what she needed to do. She pushed her sleeves up and got to work. She had cooked on less. That was the plain truth of it. She had grown up genuinely poor, the kind of poor where you learned to make a meal from whatever was left, where a good cook wasn't someone who had fine ingredients, but someone who understood how to coax everything possible from imperfect ones. She found dried herbs in a tin near the back of the pantry, shelved thyme and bay leaf, and something she thought might be sage still fragrant enough to be useful. She found a jar of lard behind the cornmeal. She found a braid of dried onions hanging near the back door. She found 3 eggs in the kitchen, presumably from that morning's laying. She went to the root cellar long enough to retrieve a handful of potatoes soft in places, but workable if you cut around the bad spots, and 3 somewhat wilted carrots. She made cornbread and salt pork stew, stretched with the onions and the carrots and the dried herbs flavored with the lard and the long, slow work of a hot fire. She made a pot of thin broth from the pork bone. Simple food, honest food. The kind that didn't require great ingredients, only patience and skill, and the knowledge of what each thing could become. By 6 o'clock, the kitchen was warm. The range was going strong, making the kind of deep, settled heat that told a room it was being properly used. The smell of food had drifted through the house and out through the back door into the yard. The 3 ranch hands came in. She had learned their names in a brief, awkward introduction. Harlan had performed sometime in the hour between her arrival and supper. Pete, the eldest, with a gray beard trimmed close and a permanent squint that suggested years of looking into wind. Danny, somewhere in his 20s, painfully thin, with the kind of restless energy of a young man who wasn't sure yet what to do with himself. And Arlo, quiet and watchful, perhaps 30, who nodded when introduced and said nothing else. They sat at the kitchen table and she put food in front of them without ceremony. Harlan sat at the end of the table. They ate. Nobody talked much. Ranchmen rarely did at the end of a full day's work. Conversation required energy, and by supper time, the energy was gone. Cecelia stood at the counter cleaning up and watching from the periphery, and she watched what mattered. They ate everything. Pete asked for a second helping of the cornbread without hesitating. Danny mopped his bowl with a torn piece of crust. Even Arlo, who gave nothing away in his expression, ate steadily and completely. When they were done, Pete looked up at her from across the table. "First warm meal in a good while," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." "I'll do better tomorrow when I know what we have to work with," she said. He nodded as though that was exactly the kind of thing he'd expected her to say. After the men had gone, Harlan sat alone at the end of the table with his coffee. She had found just enough in a small tin to make a pot, and she'd made it strong. She was washing the last of the dishes when he spoke. "You didn't tell me you could cook like that." She kept her hands in the wash water. "You didn't ask." A silence. "It was a good meal," he said. "It was a basic one. I'll need to go into town within the next few days to resupply properly, and I want to look at the root cellar in the morning." "All right." She dried her hands. She turned to face him. He was looking at her, not the measuring, cataloging look from the platform, but something slightly different, something more considered, as though he was revising some internal estimate he had made about her and was not quite sure yet what the revision meant. "Do what you were brought here to do, Pooh," he said finally, and then, as though hearing how that sounded, he added more carefully, "I mean, you have my full permission to manage the household as you see fit." She looked at him evenly. "Yes," she said, "I know." She hung her apron on the hook beside the range. She went to bed in her narrow room, listening to the Wyoming wind come down off the ridge, searching around the eaves of the house with its cold, purposeful fingers. She lay in the dark and thought about what she had found and what she would have to do about it. She had been chosen last. She was here. Tomorrow she would find out exactly what needed saving, and she would figure out how to save it. That was what she had come to do. That was what she was good at. For the first time in a very long while, she did not feel useless. She felt necessary, and for Cecelia Wainwright, that was better than anything she had ever been promised. The wedding happened 2 days later, exactly as the letter had described. No fuss before a justice of the peace in Laramie with Pete and a woman from town named Hetty standing as witnesses. The ceremony took 12 minutes. Harlan shook her hand afterward, which she found both strange and somehow appropriate. He gave her a plain gold band, his mother's, he said, looking out the window as he said it, and she put it on her finger without ceremony. She was a married woman. She drove back to the Double G in the wagon with Harlan beside her, and the Wyoming sky was white and blue above them, and neither of them said much of anything, and she thought, this is what a beginning looks like. Not a romance, not a fairy tale, A beginning plain and functional like a foundation being laid. You built on foundations. That was the point. That was what she was here to do. Cecelia was up before the sun. She had always been an early riser, not because anyone asked her to be, but because the dark hours before dawn were hers alone, and she had learned long ago that solitude was easier to find in the dark. She lit the kitchen lamp, built up the fire in the range, with the efficient movements of a woman who had done it 1,000 times, and put water on to boil. The house was still around her, the particular deep stillness of a place where everyone is asleep, and the world outside has not yet fully decided to start. She had slept well. That surprised her a little. She had expected to lie awake dissecting everything she'd seen: the sagging porch, the empty pantry, the weary men, the way Harlan Greer had looked at her with that careful, calculating expression that gave nothing away. She had expected her mind to turn restlessly through every problem and every uncertainty. Instead, she had slept. She understood why when she thought about it. Anxiety in her experience came from not knowing what you were dealing with. She knew. The situation was difficult, but it was clear, and clarity, even uncomfortable. Clarity was something she could work with. There was no unknown enemy here. There was only a great deal that needed doing. She stood in the kitchen with her coffee and made a list in her head while the house slept around her. The pantry needed restocking urgently within the next 2 days, not the week she'd mentioned to Harlan the night before. She needed to look at the root cellar, the smokehouse, and whatever remained of last autumn's stores. She needed to understand exactly how many people she was feeding and how often. She needed to assess the kitchen garden, too late in the season for much now, but she could plan for spring. She needed to understand the household budget. She needed to understand, in fact, the entire financial picture, because everything else depended on it. She was a married woman managing a household. She needed to know what resources she actually had. She poured her coffee and thought about how to approach that particular conversation. Harlan Greer wasn't, she had already concluded, a man who discussed his affairs easily. He had the manner of someone who had been managing alone for a long time and had built the habit of self-sufficiency into every aspect of his bearing. He would not offer information. He would have to be asked for it. She was very good at asking for things. After breakfast, she made oatmeal with the dried apples she'd found at the back of the pantry shelf and a pinch of the cinnamon she'd brought in her own supplies. Stretching carefully, she asked Pete to show her the root cellar. Pete was the kind of man who watched things carefully before he spoke, and what she had observed about him in the first 2 days was that he was loyal not blindly but genuinely, and that he had a working man's respect for competence. He had come to breakfast that morning and eaten her oatmeal with the focused attention of a man who had not been eating well, and when he'd set his bowl down, he had looked at her with something in his eyes that was not quite hope, but was pointed in that direction. He led her to the barn and pulled up the heavy wooden door set into the packed earth floor. She climbed down the ladder into cool dimness and waited while her eyes adjusted. It wasn't empty. That was something. But what was there told a story she was already beginning to understand. She walked slowly along the shelves. Half a dozen jars of preserved tomatoes, their lids oxidizing. A crock of what had once been sauerkraut. Dried corn in a cloth sack tied off. A smoked ham hock small. 3 jars of apple preserves, one with a broken seal spoiled. Several loose potatoes. She picked one up, pressed it, gently set it aside, soft in the center. Maybe a third of them were still usable. "How long has it been like this?" she asked without turning around. Pete was behind her on the ladder. She heard him exhale. "Since about September, maybe October. We had a cook before you, Mrs. Vickers. She left in the summer, said the wages weren't what she'd been promised." A pause. "Nobody replaced her proper. The boss has been managing on what he could. It's been a hard year, ma'am." "The finances," she said. He didn't answer. The silence was the answer. She came back up into the barn light and stood for a moment thinking. This was worse than she had initially read it. It wasn't just a household that had fallen into neglect. It was a household being deliberately starved of resources because the larger operation surrounding it was hemorrhaging money. When money ran short, food was always the last priority for men like Harlan Greer. They kept feeding the horses and repairing the fences and paying what debts they could, and the kitchen fell to whatever was left, which was often nothing. She needed the full picture, and she needed it now. She found Harlan in his office, a room off the parlor that smelled permanently of leather and old tobacco, with a large desk under the window and papers spread across it in the organized disorder of a man who understood his own system and didn't expect anyone else to. He was sitting with his hands flat on the desk, staring at the papers in front of him, with the look of a man who had already read what they said and was not finding the second reading any more encouraging than the first. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "I need to understand the financial situation," she said. The slight closing of his expression was immediate and involuntary, the reflex of a man who had been managing his own affairs for 30 years and was not accustomed to explaining himself to anyone. "That's not necessary he started. "I'm your wife," she said quietly but without yielding. "If there's a reason I need to plan the household around a restricted budget, I need to know what that reason is. I can't manage what I don't understand." She paused. "I'm not asking to interfere. I'm asking so I can do my job properly." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not quite resistance, but the last remnant of it. Then he pushed the papers across the desk toward her without a word. She sat down across from him and began to read. It took her 20 minutes to understand what she was looking at. She had no formal training in accounting, but she was a woman who had managed a household budget for years on almost nothing, and she understood the basic language of more going out than coming in. She followed the numbers with her finger column by column, and the story they told was the story of a good operation slowly breaking under accumulated pressure. The Double G had been at one point exactly what it appeared to be from the outside, a prosperous cattle ranch with 12,000 acres of solid herd, reliable contracts with several railhead buyers, and the kind of standing in Caldwell County that came from 30 years of honest work. Then 3 years ago, a drought had cut the grass. The year after that, disease had moved through the herd and taken a third of the cattle. Last year, a dispute with a neighboring rancher over water rights had cost more in legal fees than Harlan had anticipated or could afford. He had borrowed against the property to cover the losses. The bank held a note. The note was coming due in the spring. She set the papers down carefully. She looked at the numbers in the margins where he had been doing his own calculations, trying different figures, different scenarios. A man working the same problem from every angle he could think of and arriving at the same answer each time. "How many hands did you have 3 years ago?" she asked. 14, he said, "and now 3. She nodded. She folded her hands on the desk. "You sent 2 women away," she said, "or they sent themselves." His jaw tightened. "They left when they found out the situation. I can't say I blame them. What I'm offering isn't what I advertised." "I didn't leave." "No," he said, "you didn't." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to ask you something and I want an honest answer." He met her eyes. "Do you want to save this ranch?" Outside the window, a horse moved in the yard. The wind came off the ridge. In the distance, a door banged once against its frame and was still. "It's all I have," he said. "Just that. No embellishment." She nodded. "Then here is what I can do," she said. "I can stretch every food dollar you give me to 3 times its worth. I can feed your men well enough that they stay, because fed men stay, mister. Greer and hungry men leave, and you cannot afford to lose Pete or Danny or Arlo right now. I can manage the household so that nothing is wasted and everything that can be used is used. I can run this kitchen like a business because that's what it is." She paused. "I cannot fix the debt. I cannot bring back the cattle, but I can keep what remains of this operation from falling apart at the domestic level. And if the domestic level holds, everything else has a better chance, or maybe..." She paused. "That's what I came here to do. I'd like to do it properly." He stared at her across the desk. It was the longest he had looked at her directly since she'd arrived. Something in his expression had shifted from the careful blankness she was already accustomed to. Not warmth exactly, but something more open. Something that was recognizing what was in front of it. "All right," he said. It was the same 2 words she had said to him on the road from Laramie. She wondered if he remembered. She took the household ledger back to the kitchen with her and spread it across the work table and spent the better part of the afternoon with a pencil making notes. In the weeks that followed, Cecelia did what she had told him she would do. She went to town twice in the first week. The first trip was with Pete in a careful list spending Harlan's limited household budget with the precision of a woman who understood the difference between what was necessary and what was merely useful. The second trip she made alone, driving the lighter wagon herself, she had learned the route, and she preferred to negotiate without an audience. She went to see Mr. Albrecht at the general store. He was a wide, good-natured man in his 50s who had been running the Laramie store for 20 years and had a businessman's eye for reliability. He looked at her with appropriate wariness when she laid out her proposal, a running account on staple goods paid down weekly in small but consistent amounts. Most folks wanting a tab make more promises than payments, he said not unkindly. Most folks asking for a tab don't know how much they'll be buying, she said. I do. I can tell you within 5% what the double G will need over the next month, and I can tell you exactly what I can pay each week against it. Small payments regular as the calendar. Better than a large promise from a struggling operation. He looked at her for a long moment. You manage the Greer household now. I do. Mr. Greer mentioned he was sending for someone. Didn't mention she'd be coming in to renegotiate his credit arrangements. He didn't know I was going to, she said honestly. That apparently amused him. He agreed to the tab. She drove back to the Double G with supplies and with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has done something well and knows it. She established a system for the kitchen. Every morning she assessed what was on hand. Every evening she accounted for what had been used. She kept a small notebook on a nail beside the pantry door. Nothing formal, just running tallies in her cramped, practical handwriting. Flour, cornmeal, lard, dried beans, salt, coffee, sugar. What came in, what went out, what the running balance was. She made bread every other day, dense practical bread that lasted well and could be eaten as a meal in itself or stretched into other things. She made bean soup and corn chowder and salt pork stew. She made biscuits on Sundays, which had become, without anyone saying so explicitly, the closest thing the Double G had to an occasion worth noting. She learned to use the smokehouse. Pete showed her the basic method, the wood to use the temperature to maintain how long different cuts needed, and she improved on what he'd shown her, smoking the last of the pork shoulder she'd bought in town and a large batch of the venison Danny had brought in after a weekend hunt. Smoked meat kept. Smoked meat meant food in February when fresh was hard to come by, and she was already thinking toward February. She rebuilt the kitchen garden. Not for now, it was too late in the season for planting, but for spring. She dug and turned and composted through the cold November days, working in her coat and her heavy boots, planning what would go where. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, cabbage. Things that kept, things that were useful, things that earned their place. The men noticed. Not dramatically working men rarely acknowledge improvement in the way someone might in a story, but they showed up for meals on time, which they hadn't been doing before she arrived. They lingered a little longer over their coffee. Pete started leaving his muddy boots at the kitchen door instead of tracking across the floor, which was in its own quiet way a form of respect. Danny, who was young enough that he'd probably never learned any particular table manners, started saying thank you after every meal. It came out a little awkwardly at first, like a phrase he was practicing, but within 2 weeks it sounded natural. Arlo, who had said almost nothing in Cecilia's first 2 weeks at the ranch, told her one evening without looking up from his plate that the cornbread was better than his grandmother's. Your grandmother probably had better ingredients than I do, she said. Probably, he agreed. But yours tastes better. She almost laughed. She decided against it because she sensed it might embarrass him, but she took the compliment home to her private thoughts and kept it there. Where Harlan Greer remained distant. Not unkind, she wanted to be precise about that because it mattered to her that she was precise about things. He was not a man who dismissed or condescended or made her feel small. He thanked her for meals, answered her practical questions with practical answers, approved her household requests without complaint. He was polite. He was fair. But he did not speak to her beyond what was necessary. He did not inquire about her day or ask about her plans or show any interest in who she was outside of her function. She was the person who managed his household. He was the person she reported to. The arrangement was what it was. She had not expected more. Still, there were moments. One evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table after supper, working in her notebook, recalculating the food stores for the coming month. She heard him come in for water. He often came to the kitchen late in the evening. She had learned when he was working late in the office. He stopped when he saw her at the table. "What are you doing?" "Working out whether we can afford a full barrel of cornmeal or just a half this month," she said without looking up. He was quiet for a moment. "We can afford the full barrel," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She looked up then, not because of what he'd said, but because of something in how he'd said it. Not the flat managed tone he usually employed, but something different. Something that sounded less like a rancher approving a household budget and more like a man making a commitment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He got his water. He left. The full barrel of cornmeal arrived 3 days later, carried into the kitchen by Danny on Harlan's instructions. She put her hand on the barrel and thought about what it meant, not the barrel itself, but the quiet deliberateness of it. The fact that he had remembered, had followed through, had done the thing he said he'd do, and she decided not to think about it too hard. She was not here for sentiment. She was here to work. And the work was good. The work was, in fact, the thing she had been waiting her whole life to have enough of. It was in her second month at the ranch that she learned the full weight of what Harlan was carrying. She had gone to Laramie with Pete for the regular supply run. While Pete was loading the wagon at the general store, she stopped at the post office to collect the ranch's mail, a task she had taken over because it was practical and because nobody else seemed to remember to do it consistently. There was a letter from the bank, addressed to Harlan, sealed. She put it with the other mail and didn't think about it on the drive back. But when she handed it to him that evening, she watched his face when he read it. He sat very still for a long time. Not rigid still, the way a man is still when he is absorbing something he has already been half expecting and has not quite finished dreading. His eyes moved to the bottom of the page and stayed there. Then he folded the letter once precisely and put it in the top drawer of his desk. And he sat staring at the wall. She left him alone. That night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, she went to Pete. "How bad is it?" she asked. Pete was sitting on the bunkhouse step in the cold, smoking a pipe. He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the night. "Bank's calling the note early," he said. "Greer had till spring. Now they want resolution by end of February." He drew on the pipe. "He's been trying to sell the north section 1,200 acres to cover it. But the man who might buy it is taking his time. And if he can't cover it, they take the ranch." His voice was flat with the particular flatness of a man who has already spent time contemplating something terrible and arrived at the far side of it. "The whole thing, every acre." Cecelia sat with that. The double G 12,000 acres. The house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the kitchen garden she'd turned with her own hands. The horses in the paddock. The 3 men in the bunkhouse who had stayed because staying still felt like believing in something. Harlan Greer's 30 years of work and drought and loss and labor. All of it, gone. She thought about the look on his face when he'd read the letter. The stillness of a man who had already been carrying this for a long time and was simply absorbing another increment of it. She went back to the kitchen. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote across the top in her careful hand, "What we have, what we can do, what we can save." She worked until midnight. When she finally set down her pencil, her eyes ached, and the lamp was burning low. Outside the ranch was quiet. The animals settled the wind still. The Wyoming sky overhead brilliant with winter stars in a way that made the darkness feel more like something to look at than something to be afraid of. She sat in the quiet kitchen for a while, just sitting, and thought, "I am not going anywhere." 2 women had been offered this place and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. She had decided differently, and she intended to mean it. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Winter came down hard on Wyoming that year. By early December, the temperature dropped below freezing before noon and stayed there. The wind off the mountains came in long, searching gusts that found every gap in the walls, every loose board, every place where the house had been, quietly letting the cold in for years without anyone doing anything about it. The cold was not dramatic about it. It didn't howl or rage. It simply persisted, patient and thorough, the way cold in Wyoming persists, as though it has all the time in the world and knows it. Cecelia found every gap. She did it systematically one evening when the wind was still, and she could use a candle to see where the flame bent, moving from room to room, floor to ceiling, noting each place. She stuffed rags into the worst of them. She nailed boards where they'd come loose along the exterior walls. She convinced Pete on a rare warm afternoon in early December to help her bank earth against the North Foundation wall, which had been letting cold seep up through the kitchen floor in a way that made her ankles ache by mid-morning. You know, Pete said as they worked with shovels in the thin December sunlight, most housekeepers I've known would have just put on thicker stockings. Most housekeepers you've known were managing a house that had heat to spare, she said. He laughed a short, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes when something is funnier than expected. She kept the range burning steadily and learned the rhythm of the house's heat, which rooms warmed first, which stayed cold, regardless how long after the morning fire it took before the parlor was habitable. She found extra blankets in a trunk in the upstairs hall and took them to the bunkhouse without asking permission. Pete thanked her. Danny looked at his blanket as though it might disappear if he examined it too carefully. Arlo said nothing, but he folded it with a particular care that said something. She kept cooking. This was she had come to understand her primary instrument, not because food was all she had to offer, but because, in a struggling household in a difficult winter, consistent nourishing food was the most direct way she had of keeping people from leaving. And if the people left, the ranch was finished, regardless of what the bank decided. She made chili from the dried beans and the smoked meat stretched with canned tomatoes and dried peppers rich with lard in the slow work of low heat. She made potato soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, flavored with the dried onions she'd threaded on string and hung in the pantry in October. She made apple cake on Sundays using the dried apples and the molasses she'd traded for with a jar of her preserved tomatoes at the general store. She had begun trading preserved goods for staples, a small informal economy she had built around the ranch's kitchen without anyone asking her to. It had started with Hetty. Hetty was the woman who had witnessed the wedding, warm and plain-spoken and observant, in the way of women who have lived in small towns long enough to understand that information and exchange are the same thing. She had come out to the Double G for a visiting call in November, which Cecelia had regarded as a practical opportunity as much as a social one. In the course of 2 cups of coffee and a half hour of conversation, she had mentioned that she had more dried corn than she needed and that she had been meaning to ask whether the Double G needed any. Cecelia had offered preserved tomatoes in exchange. Word traveled the way word does in small towns, and by January there was a modest but steady flow of exchange going: a farm wife with extra large trading for smoked meat, a woman with surplus pickled beets exchanging for Cecilia's cornmeal bread, a family with too many dried apples trading for a few jars of her preserved plum. Nothing large, nothing formal, but something. She was building a small economy around the ranch's kitchen, and she was doing it from nothing, using only what she had and the relationships she had started to build. Harlan noticed. He came through the kitchen sometimes in the evenings on his way to the office and stopped in the doorway watching her work, and she could see the recalculation happening in his expression, the same look from the first night updated and revised accounting for information he hadn't had before. He didn't say anything about the trading. He watched and he went on. So, it was Pete who first told her things were different. It was a cold January morning, the range going strong, the bread rising. Pete had come in to fix a shelf bracket in the pantry that had finally given way under the weight of the cornmeal barrel. He worked with the unhurried competence of a man who had spent his life repairing things, and Cecelia worked around him, and for a while there was just the sound of the hammer and the smell of baking bread and the wind outside. Then Pete said without preamble, "I was going to leave before Christmas." She looked up from the bread she was kneading. "I'd made up my mind," he continued, driving a nail with practiced ease. "Ranch is dying, I figured. No shame in finding work elsewhere while I still had the choice." He tested the bracket, pressed it, added another nail. "Then you came." She said nothing. She kept kneading. "The food helped," he said. "I won't lie about that. A man gets hungry enough, he goes where the food is, and that's just the truth of it. But it wasn't only the food." He set down his hammer and looked at her directly, the way Pete rarely looked at anything head on. It was that the house felt like a house again. She dusted flour from her hands. "What do you mean?" "A place like this, when it's running right, it's got a feeling. Like something is being held together. The last couple years, it felt like everything was just coming apart room by room, day by day, and nobody was trying to stop it. Like the place had given up on itself." He picked up his hammer again. "You changed that." She didn't know what to say to that. She thought about the things he might mean: the bread, the heat banked in the range, the blankets in the bunkhouse, the small, tight economy she was running out of the pantry notebook. And she thought about how different those things sounded when someone put them into words. "I'm just managing the household," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Pete said. "That's what I said." Danny stayed for reasons she suspected, but he never articulated. He was young enough that the double G had become, in the months since she had arrived, something close to what she imagined. He'd never had a place with warmth in it, with regular meals with someone who paid attention to whether he was eating and wearing enough and staying warm. She noticed that he had started chopping wood without being asked, that he was learning she was teaching him without making instruction of it how to bank a fire properly so it lasted the night. That when she put an extra biscuit on his plate some mornings without comment, he ate it with the particular focused silence of someone trying not to call attention to how much it meant. One morning in January, she came into the kitchen to find him already there, having started the range without being asked, standing next to it with his hands near the warmth of it, and looking out the window at the gray pre-dawn yard with an expression she recognized as contentment. He saw her in the doorway and straightened up quickly. I figured you could use the fire already going," he said. "I can," she said. "Thank you, Danny." He nodded. He went out to start his morning work. But she stood by the range he'd started and felt something she hadn't been expecting, a particular warmth that wasn't just from the fire. Arlo, the most private of the three, she understood least and perhaps respected most. He said almost nothing. He showed up, he worked, he ate. He occasionally sat in the kitchen after supper, with no apparent reason to be there, just present, the way a cat finds the warmest spot in a house and occupies it without apology, as though it has always been there and always will be. She didn't require him to explain himself. She put coffee on and let him be. This was she was learning the thing she was perhaps best at: letting people be what they needed to be, without requiring them to perform an explanation for her benefit. Harlan Greer remained through all of it the most complicated part of the picture. She had by January built a working portrait of him, from observation, the way you build any portrait of a private person, not from what they tell you, but from what you notice when they think no one is watching. He was not a bad man. She had established that early, and it remained true. He was not cruel or contemptuous or dismissive. He was a man who had spent the last several years living primarily in the present tense of loss. His wife, whose name was spoken only once briefly by Pete, with the careful tone of a subject that was not to be lingered upon. His herd reduced to almost nothing. His finances, which were a slow emergency he was managing alone. His standing in the county, which had diminished as the Double G's difficulties became apparent. He had closed off the parts of himself that weren't strictly necessary for daily survival, and he had done it so long that he had begun, she suspected, to forget that those parts had ever been there. She recognized this pattern. She had done a version of it herself. What she observed over the weeks of December and January was a very slow, very guarded softening, not toward her specifically, not in any romantic sense she would have put a name to, but towards the household itself, toward the fact of it functioning. He seemed cautiously to be allowing himself to notice that things were better, that there was food, that there was warmth, that the men had stayed. He started coming to the kitchen for his coffee in the mornings instead of taking it to his office. That was a small thing. Small things in her experience were usually what mattered most. He started answering Pete's questions at the supper table instead of leaving immediately after eating. He stayed for a second cup sometimes. He said one evening about nothing in particular, just the weather, just a comment about the wind changing direction, that it seemed like the worst of the cold might ease by February. Pete and Danny both went still for a moment. She noticed the way people go still when someone who has been silent for a very long time says something almost hopeful. Cecelia continued washing dishes, but she noticed. She fell asleep at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night in the third week of December. This was not her intention. She had been up since 4 that morning, a full baking day, and then the monthly accounts, and then a trip to town that had taken longer than expected, and then a lengthy project reorganizing the root cellar that had turned into 3 hours because she discovered a section of shelving that had quietly rotted through. By the time supper was done and the dishes were clean and the men had gone, she had sat down at the kitchen table with her notebook and her evening tea, intending to work through the food calculations for January. She did not make it through the food calculations for January. She woke somewhere in the very early morning, disoriented, stiff-necked. The lamp burning low, the fire quiet but still holding, and there was a blanket around her shoulders. She sat very still. The blanket was wool substantial, the kind that had real weight and warmth. It smelled of cedar chips, the kind stored in the upstairs chest where she kept the good blankets. She knew because she had inventoried every blanket in the house in November. She looked at the fire. It had been banked just right, not smothered, not left to die, but tended to the precise point where it would hold through the night. That was a specific skill. Not everyone knew how. She sat with the blanket around her shoulders and listened to the house. Outside, the wind had dropped. Inside, everything was quiet. She was alone in the kitchen. She thought about who had come in and found her asleep at the table, who had turned the lamp to low so the oil wouldn't waste out, who had banked the fire with that particular care, who had gone upstairs for a blanket from the cedar chest and brought it back down and laid it over her shoulders without waking her. She knew the answer. She sat with it for a while. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire and thought with the same careful precision she brought to everything. This is not what I came here for. This is not what was offered, and this is not what I expected, and I will not make it into something it isn't. But she also thought he could have left you cold. He didn't. She folded the blanket the next morning and carried it to her room and put it at the foot of her bed, where she slept under it for the rest of the winter. Neither of them mentioned it. If he wanted to acknowledge it, he could. He did not. But something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be pointed to or named, but something had shifted in the way that foundations shift when the frost goes deep and then comes up again. Change without changing, altered without announcement. She thought about it sometimes late at night in her narrow bed, listening to the Wyoming wind. She thought that is what it feels like to be seen by someone who is not trying to see you. It was terrifying. It was also, she admitted to herself in the dark, in the quiet, the best feeling she had had in a very long time. The North Section sale went through in the last week of January. She heard it from Pete, who had heard it from Harlan himself, which was already notable, because Harlan did not, in her experience, discuss the financial situation with anyone. But Pete came into the kitchen that evening while she was making the cornbread for her supper and said quietly that the deal had closed. The note was covered. The bank was satisfied. The double G was not going to be seized. She set the bread pan down carefully. Good, she said. Good, Pete agreed. That night at supper, nobody made a speech about it. This was not that kind of household, and none of them were that kind of people. Danny poured himself a second coffee with the deliberate satisfaction of a man marking an occasion privately. Pete said to no one in particular that he reckoned the place might see another spring after all. Arlo ate with a particular focused calm, the calm of a man who has been waiting for something and has just received it. Harlan said nothing. But at the end of supper, when Cecelia was setting the last of the bread on the table, he looked up at her. Not long, just a moment, just long enough. She looked back. Then she looked away, and he looked away, and the moment passed the way moments do at the double G, without comment, without ceremony, quietly and completely. But she carried it. By March, things were measurably better. Not prosperous, not yet. The sale of the North Section had covered the note, but left the operation lean. 3 hands, a depleted herd, hard months still ahead. But the pantry was properly stocked. The household accounts were balanced. The kitchen garden was planned and partly dug. The small trading economy she had built had been formalized into a genuine arrangement with 3 families in town, preserved goods in exchange for staple supplies, a steady barter that reduced the cash requirements for the kitchen and put actual food on the table at a cost that didn't strain the budget. And she had, without asking permission or making an announcement, begun selling her surplus baking. It had started by accident. She had made too much apple cake. She'd misjudged the dried apple supply and overcorrected, and Hetty had asked if she could buy one to bring to a gathering. Cecelia had charged a modest amount. Word had gotten around. By February, there were occasional town families sending wagons out for orders of bread and preserves. Nothing large, nothing that required any particular accounting, but income, actual income flowing back into the kitchen. She mentioned it to Harlan one evening. Briefly in passing, I've been selling the surplus baking and preserves. I'm putting the income toward kitchen supplies. He looked at her for a long moment. That's your money, he said. It goes to the kitchen, she said. Then it's the ranch's money. which means it's yours anyway. He paused. You're the one running it. She blinked. He left before she could respond, which was entirely like him saying the thing and then not waiting to see what it did, as though he'd delivered a package, and the contents were no longer his responsibility. But she stood in the kitchen for a long time after holding those four words. You're the one running it, and she thought about what they meant coming from a man who did not offer praise. He didn't mean. She thought about whether being chosen last was entirely what she'd always believed it was. She was beginning to think it might not be. Spring came to the double G the way Wyoming spring always came, not gradually, not gently, but in sudden bright assertions that made you understand why people waited for it the way they did. One morning the world was still bitter and brown. 2 days later, green had appeared overnight in the precise, almost miraculous way that Wyoming spring produced it. Not a gradual greening, but a sudden announcement, as though the land had simply decided it was time. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the yard and the paddock, then from the kitchen garden where Cecelia had been waiting for it since November. She was out there at first light most mornings in April, kneeling in the cold mud in her heavy skirt and her worn work coat, putting in the seeds she had been planting since she arrived. Potatoes, onions, carrots, turnips, parsnips, 2 long rows of cabbage, herbs along the south-facing wall where the stone would hold the warmth. She worked with the particular contentment of someone doing exactly the work they were built for, methodical, unhurried, invested in an outcome that was months away. The ranch was stirring with a different energy that spring. The banknote was settled. The land sale was done. There was room to breathe for the first time in years, and something about that room, that simple absence of immediate crisis, was changing the quality of the air at the Double G. Harlan had been corresponding with cattle buyers taking the first small steps toward rebuilding the herd. He had mentioned in his spare factual way that there might be money to hire a fourth hand by summer if the season went well. Danny had been promoted to something close to foreman, which had straightened his spine and given his eyes a focus they hadn't had before. Pete moved around the ranch with the particular contentment of a man who had made a bet everyone else had written off and won. The Double G felt for the first time since Cecelia had arrived like a place building towards something instead of retreating from it, and the wider world, it turned out, was beginning to notice. She first heard about Dorothea Calloway from Hetty on a Tuesday in mid-April, when she had driven to town for the regular supply run and stopped in at Hetty's house for the cup of coffee that had become a standing habit between them. Hetty was a woman who understood information and understood it clearly enough to know when to share it and when to hold it and when the decision was harder than either. She had been stirring her coffee for longer than usual before she spoke. There's a widow on the east side of town, Hetty said. Dorothea Calloway. Her husband passed 2 years ago, Edwin Calloway, who had cattle and investments and a great deal of both. He left her quite well off. She paused. She's been socially active, you might say, since the spring thaw. I saw her at the merchants' dinner last week. She was speaking with Mr. Greer for quite some time. Cecelia kept her expression still. Did she? She said. She's very handsome, Hetty said with the careful neutrality of a woman being accurate about something she might wish were otherwise. And very well dressed. She has a way of making things seem easy, people and situations both. Men find it pleasant to be around someone who makes things seem easy. A pause that said more than the words around it. I thought you should know. Cecelia thanked her. She drove the wagon home along the road she had learned in all its seasons, now the place where the ground got soft in the thaw, the bend where the wind came off the ridge and hit the wagon sideways, the long, straight stretch where you could see the Double G from 2 miles out if the sky was clear. She let herself feel what she was feeling, the way she let herself do in the wagon where no one was watching. She was afraid. Not jealous, or not only jealous, not in any simple way. She was feeling the deep, specific fear of a woman who had learned over a lifetime that she was always replaceable, that she had never in any permanent sense been anyone's first choice, that the things she offered, steadiness, competence, the slow, reliable warmth of a well-run household, were the kinds of things people were grateful for, right up until something brighter and easier came along. She had told herself when she arrived at the Double G that she was not here for sentiment, that she was here for purpose, that she didn't need to be loved, only needed. But somewhere in the winter months, in the kitchen, in the cold mornings, in the small, quiet shifts she had witnessed, she had started to feel something she hadn't expected. She had started to care about the ranch, about Pete and Danny and Arlo, and the fragile, particular pride that was rebuilding itself among them. About the kitchen garden she'd put in with her own hands, and the kitchen sign she'd been calling Greer's Kitchen in her head since November. About the way this place felt in the early morning before anyone else was up, when the world was still and quiet and entirely hers. About Harlan Greer, who had put a blanket around her shoulders in December and never said a word about it. She drove the rest of the way home in silence. She met Dorothea Calloway in the first week of May. Harlan had mentioned a dinner in his brief, practical way, not unusual, she had learned, for a ranch owner of his standing. Some things were done for reasons of business, even when they felt social, and she had come to understand these occasions as part of the operation of a cattle ranch as much as any other work. He had mentioned 3 guests. He had not mentioned names. Dorothea Calloway arrived in a fine carriage drawn by a matched pair of gray horses, wearing a dress of deep blue wool that fit her with the precision of something made by a skilled dressmaker. She was perhaps 45, dark-haired, elegantly slim, with the kind of effortless beauty that suggested she had always been beautiful, and had arranged her life accordingly. She moved with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had always been looked at and found nothing to be self-conscious about. She was gracious to Cecelia in the way that a woman of standing is gracious to the help when she has decided to be magnanimous, warm enough to be polite, not warm enough to be sincere. She complimented the flowers Cecelia had arranged on the dining table with the tone of someone who had expected less. "How clever," she said. "Are those from the kitchen garden?" "They are," Cecelia said. "How resourceful," Dorothea said, and moved past her into the parlor. The dinner went well technically. Cecelia had cooked. Of course she had cooked. That was her place, and she knew it a meal as fine as anything. The Double G's kitchen had produced roasted venison with a dried herb crust, spring greens and vinegar, dressing, potato gratin with the last of the winter cream, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and an apple cake with brown sugar glaze that she had spent the better part of the afternoon on. She served it and retreated to the kitchen, which was her place, and she could hear the conversation from there, not clearly enough to follow, but enough to understand the shape of it. Dorothea laughed frequently. She had a lovely laugh, light, practiced with the effortless ease of a woman who had learned that men felt clever when she laughed at their remarks and had been deploying that knowledge for decades. Cecelia washed the serving dishes. She dried them. She put them away. After the other guests departed, Dorothea stayed. Cecelia went to bed. She lay in her room in the dark, intending to sleep, and for a while she almost did. But the house was still that night, and the walls were thin, and the sound carried. She did not listen on purpose, but she heard. Dorothea Calloway was offering him money. Not in those crude terms, she was far too practiced for that, but the shape of it was unmistakable. She was speaking of resources, of combining them, of the potential of the Double G under the right financial foundations. She spoke of her late husband's estate, of the possibilities that capital could open for a well-run cattle operation. She spoke of his reputation in the county, of what he had built here, and what could be built yet. And then in a tone so reasonable and so warm, it was almost kind, she said that she assumed his current arrangement was a practical one. She said arrangement, not marriage, not wife, and that practical arrangements by their nature served their purpose and then made way for what was better suited to the long term. There was a silence. Cecelia lay absolutely still. She heard Harlan say something. She couldn't make out the words, just the tone, which was flat and short. She heard Dorothea say she would leave him to consider it, and that she hoped he would think carefully because opportunities of this kind did not remain available indefinitely. She heard a chair, footsteps, the front door opening and closing. Cecelia lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. Practical arrangement. She turned the phrase over. She thought about the 9 rejection notices in the tin box under her bed in Hays, Kansas. She thought about the train platform and Mildred's face and the sound of the wheels on the rails carrying her west. She thought about her first night in this kitchen with an empty pantry and 4 hungry men and no one to tell her she was doing it right. She thought about everything she had done since: the bread, the blankets, the notebook, the garden, the winter. The way Danny had learned to bank a fire, and the way Pete had laughed that one time, and the way Arlo sat in the kitchen in the evenings for no reason she could name except that it was where the warmth was. She thought, I have done what I came here to do. And then she thought, and it still isn't enough. It had never been enough. She had known that when she got on the train. She had told herself she had made peace with it. She was a practical woman. She was not here for love. She was not here to be first. She was here to be useful, and she had been useful, and now something better had come along, and this was how it went. She did not cry. She thought about where she might go. She had savings, small but real, from the kitchen income she had been building. She had skills documented now in the notebook on the kitchen wall. She had, if she was honest, more than she'd come with. She began in the dark, in the quiet, to make plans. Not with bitterness, not with anger. With the same practical precision she brought to everything. She would not make a scene. She would not demand explanations or ask him to choose, because she was not a woman in a story, and she already knew how the choice would likely come out. She would put everything in order: the kitchen, the garden schedule, the pantry system, the trading arrangements, and she would document it all for whoever came next. And then she would leave quietly with her dignity, which was the one thing she had always managed to keep. She closed her eyes. She made her plans. She began to put things in order the next morning. She completed the kitchen inventory with particular thoroughness. She wrote detailed notes in her careful hand: the garden schedule for the season ahead, the pantry management system, the trading arrangements with the families in town, the smokehouse procedure, the baking schedule, the approach to winter preparation. She put these notes in a folder on the work table, organized by category with small explanations where the system required them. Whoever came next would have everything they needed. She wrote a brief letter to Pete thanking him for his help and his company. She could not explain the departure in words that didn't sound like grievance, and she had no desire to grieve out loud, so she kept it short and said only that she had valued knowing him. On the second day, she packed her trunk. She did it slowly and with care. She folded her dresses, her aprons, the small personal items she had accumulated over the months, the extra candles she kept by her bed, the small notebook she had filled with recipes and household calculations, the thin book of poetry she had read on the train coming west and had never quite gotten around to reading again. She folded her aprons last. She had arrived with two. She had bought a third during the winter. She laid all three on top, smooth and precise. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and put her hands in her lap. Through the connecting door, she could smell the kitchen. Wood smoke and flour and the mineral smell of the iron range, and something else that she couldn't name exactly, the particular smell of a place that was cared for, that was alive. She had cooked in that kitchen nearly every day for 7 months. She knew every shelf, every quirk of the fire, every morning draft from the east window when the wind changed direction. She put her hand on the connecting door and held it there. Then she stood up. She straightened her back. She picked up her trunk. She was a woman who had been chosen last all her life. She knew how to leave without making a fuss about it. He was in the barn when she came through the yard. She had not planned to say goodbye to him. She had planned to leave the notes, leave the house in order, and slip away the way she had arrived, practically without ceremony. She had told herself this was the dignified way, the way that preserved what remained of the arrangement without requiring either of them to say things that would only make both of them uncomfortable. But Harlan came out of the barn at exactly the moment she crossed the yard, and he saw her, and he saw the trunk, and he stopped. He went still in the way she had come to know, that particular stillness of a man absorbing information he hadn't been expecting. He looked at the trunk, he looked at her face, he looked at the trunk again. "Where are you going?" She kept her voice even. "I think it's time I moved on, Mr. Greer. The ranch is stable now. You don't need me in the same way." "I didn't say that." "No," she said. "You didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. The morning birds were going in the brush along the fence line. A horse moved in the paddock. The spring air smelled of mud and new grass and something opening. "Cecelia, I left notes in the kitchen," she said. "Everything is documented: the garden schedule, the pantry system, the trading arrangements. Whoever manages the household next will have everything they need." He moved. She didn't register it until he was standing directly in front of her, closer than he had ever stood, voluntarily close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the particular set of his jaw, and something in his expression that she had never seen before. Something undone. Something that looked like a man who had just understood something several moments too late and knew it. "Sit down with me," he said. She looked at him. Please, he said, and the word came out roughened, like a word he hadn't used in a long time and had to remind himself how to say. She set down her trunk. They sat on the porch steps. Not inside the parlor felt too formal. The kitchen felt like her territory in a way neither of them was ready to acknowledge, and neither of them suggested it. So they sat on the porch steps in the May morning, side by side, with a foot of space between them, looking out at the yard where the spring light was coming across the ridge in long gold angles, and the first thin green of the kitchen garden was visible along the south wall. Harlan sat with his hands between his knees. He didn't speak for a while, and she was accustomed enough to his silences to know that rushing them produced nothing useful. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Calloway said." "So have I," she said. "I imagine." He looked at the yard. "I want you to know I haven't given her an answer." She looked at him. "Why not?" He turned to face her then directly the way he rarely did, with the particular quality of attention that felt like something being offered rather than withheld. "Because I couldn't figure out how to explain something," he said. She waited. "She called your situation here a practical arrangement." He said the words carefully as though examining them for what they actually contained. She said practical arrangements serve their purpose and then make way for better suited ones. I know what she said. She was wrong. The morning was very quiet around them. Cecelia looked at the kitchen garden, at the thin green lines she had planted in cold April soil on the bet that spring would come. The ranch being solvent, Harlan said. The men staying, the house being what it is now. He paused, looking for words with the effortful care of a man who didn't use them easily and knew it. None of that would have happened without what you did. And what you did, it wasn't a practical arrangement. You could have done the minimum. You could have kept the kitchen running and called it enough. You didn't do that. I did it because it needed doing, she said. I know. He exhaled. That's the thing I couldn't explain to someone like Mrs. Calloway. She sees the ranch and she sees an asset. She sees me and she sees a position. She doesn't see what, she said when he stopped. He was quiet for a moment. Out in the paddock, one of the horses moved. A bird called from somewhere along the fence line. The notebook on the kitchen table, he said. 3 in the morning, every dollar accounted for. The blankets in the bunkhouse. Danny learning to bank a fire because you showed him how without making him feel small for not knowing. He looked at his hands. Pete laughing, Cecelia. I don't know the last time I heard that before you came. The cornbread. The way the men come to supper now like it means something to them. The way the kitchen smells in the morning. He shook his head slightly. I can pay someone to work. I can pay someone to cook. I cannot buy what you gave this place. She was very still. I paid for a wife, he said quietly. That's what I thought I was doing when I wrote to that agency. The arrangement, the fee, the listing. He said the word as though it had always felt wrong in his mouth, and he was finally admitting it. But what you gave this place was never something I paid for. It was never something I could have. She looked at him. Harlan, she said, his name, just his name without the mister. She felt the weight of that the first time she had said it without the formality in 7 months. I should have said this months ago, he said. I'm aware of that. You're saying it now. I'm asking you not to go. He met her eyes. Not because the ranch needs managing. Because when I came into the kitchen in December and found you asleep at the table with your hands still on your pencil, I put that blanket around your shoulders and I stood there. For a while, after. He looked at something in the middle distance. I stood there and I thought, this is what a house is supposed to feel like. This is what I forgot. What it feels like when someone cares about a place the way you'd care about it if it was yours. He paused. I didn't want to forget that again. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about 7 months. She thought about all the things said in practical terms that had never been entirely practical. The barrel of cornmeal, you're the one running it, the brief rare moments when his expression had gone unguarded, and she'd seen something underneath the management that she had not permitted herself to name. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, really chosen, clearly chosen by a man who had other options and was looking at her instead. Mrs. Calloway is very beautiful, she said. Yes, he said without hesitation. She has a great deal of money. She does. She would be a suitable match by any conventional measure. She would. She looked at him. Why am I still sitting here? She said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then so unexpectedly that she felt it go straight through her, he almost smiled. A small thing barely there, the kind of smile that appeared before it had decided whether to stay. Because I asked you to, he said, and because I believe you already know the answer to your own question. She looked at the kitchen garden, at the thin green lines she had put in the cold ground in April, on the belief that spring would come. It had. It always did if you were willing to wait for it. She set her hands in her lap. I'm going to need a larger kitchen garden, she said. I know, proper shelving in the root cellar. The wood that's there now is half rotted through. I'll see to it. And I want a sign, she said. He blinked. A sign. For the kitchen. She looked at him steadily. I'd like it to say, Greer's Kitchen. It's what I've been calling it in my head since November. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face through the careful blankness, through the measured distance. Something warmer and more open than she had ever seen from him before. I'll make it myself, he said, if you tell me what you want. She nodded. She stood up. She picked up her trunk. She carried it back inside. She did not suddenly become beautiful. She was the same woman who had stepped off the train in Laramie 7 months before, broad-shouldered, wide-hipped, plain-faced, with rough hands and sensible shoes, and a mind that never stopped calculating. She was 37 years old, and she was not going to be young again. She was not going to be the kind of woman that turned heads on the street. She was not going to be Dorothea Calloway's competition by any visible measure. None of that changed. What changed was something else. She moved through the house differently, not with more confidence, exactly. She had always had confidence in the quiet, unglamorous way of women who are very good at useful things, but with something more open, something that was less braced for the blow, something that had stopped waiting for the proof that she didn't belong here and had started simply being here. Harlan changed too slowly, which was his nature, and without production, which was also his nature. But the changes were real, and they accumulated. He talked at supper. Not much, not like a man discovering conversation for the first time, but more than he had in the specific way of a man who had decided to rejoin a world he had been standing slightly outside of. He asked Pete about the fence line repairs and listened to the answer. He told Danny something about the north pasture that made Danny straighten up and take notes in his head. He told Arlo something about his boyhood in Missouri that made Arlo actually laugh, a full, unexpected sound that brought the whole table to stillness for a moment, because none of them had heard it before. He came to the kitchen in the evenings. This was new, and it was not small. He brought his coffee and sat at the table and read the week-old newspaper from town, or sometimes just sat without the newspaper in the way of a person who is comfortable in a place and doesn't need to justify being in it. Cecelia worked around him. She dried dishes, organized the pantry, wrote in her notebook. They didn't always talk. The silence between them had a quality now that was entirely different from the managed distance of the early months. It was the silence of people who were accustomed to each other, who knew where the other one was without having to look, who didn't need words to fill the space, because the space itself was already full of something. She had spent most of her adult life being overlooked. She was not accustomed to being noticed. Quietly, consistently, without performance or announcement, but noticed. She was learning what that felt like. She found not entirely sure what to do with it. She had built herself for a long time around the assumption of absence, the assumption that warmth and belonging were things that happened to other people, that her job was to provide them, rather than to receive them. She had been very good at that job. She had been so good at it that she had almost forgotten the job was not the entire point. She was remembering. He made the sign in June. She didn't watch him make it because he didn't make it anywhere she was watching. She learned about it from Danny, who came into the kitchen one morning with the suppressed energy of someone managing information, and told her that Mr. Greer had been in the barn with a piece of pine board and a carving knife for the better part of 2 evenings. Did he say what he was making? She asked. No, ma'am, Danny said, and left quickly. She found the sign the next morning. He had hung it during the night she had gone to bed, and it hadn't been there, and when she came into the kitchen before dawn and lit the lamp, it was on the wall. He had hung it squarely plumb and level just above the work table where she could see it from the range. Not too high, not too low, exactly where it should be. Greer's Kitchen. The letters were carved in pine with patience and care. She could see the time in it, the clean edges where he'd taken the knife, slow the smooth surface where he'd sanded until there was nothing left to catch. He had not rushed it. He had made it the way he made everything she was learning, with quiet, deliberate attention, without announcement, without asking for credit. She stood in front of it for a long time. She put her hand against the wood. The carved letters, the smooth surface. She could feel the grain of the pine under her fingertips, in the slight depth of each letter, in the particular texture of something made by a careful hand. She stood there for a long time in the early morning dark. Then she tied on her apron. She built up the fire. She started the morning biscuits, because the men would be hungry at 6, and hunger did not wait for sentiment. But she made the biscuits with the sign at the edge of her vision, and she was smiling when she made them, and the biscuits that morning were the best she had made since she arrived. In the weeks that followed, the Double G continued its quiet recovery. Harlan had engaged 2 new cattle buyers, both from further west, and the herd was beginning to grow again, slowly, carefully, the way a man rebuilds something after he has understood what losing it costs. He was deliberate about it in a way he hadn't been before, as though the difficulty had taught him a patience that the easier years hadn't. He talked to Pete about the North pasture with a specificity that suggested he was thinking years ahead rather than weeks. Danny had settled into his foreman role with a seriousness that was good to see. He had opinions now considered ones offered at the right moments, and Harlan listened to them, which was the best thing Harlan could have done for Danny's confidence. Arlo remained Arlo, quiet, present, showing up, doing the work. He had started, she noticed, leaving small things for her, sometimes a bucket of water refilled before she needed it, a piece of firewood cut to a length she preferred. He never said anything about it. She never said anything about it. This was the language they spoke, and it worked fine. The trading arrangements with the town families had continued to expand. By June, she was selling preserves and bread regularly enough that she had started keeping a separate ledger for its small columns. Nothing complicated, but a real accounting. The income went to the kitchen, which meant it went to the ranch, which Harlan had said was the same thing as hers, and she was still thinking about that. One Sunday evening in late June, Harlan came into the kitchen while she was finishing the accounts. He poured himself a coffee and sat down across from her at the table, and for a while he just watched her work. "You ever regret it?" he said. She looked up. "Regret what?" "Coming here." He looked at his coffee cup. "Knowing what you know now about what you were walking into." She considered that honestly, the way she considered everything. "No," she said. "No, I came here because there wasn't somewhere else I needed to be," she said. "And then I found somewhere I needed to be. That's not a thing to regret." She paused. "Do you go?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "Just I dim." She went back to her accounts. He drank his coffee. Outside, the Wyoming evening was long and gold, the sky holding its light well past 9 the way summer skies in the high country did. The ranch was quiet, the animals settled the men in the bunkhouse, the garden showing the full green abundance of midsummer. Everything she had planted in the cold April mud was now tall and thriving. She thought, "I put those in the ground. I held this place together through the winter. I am the reason those men are still here. I am the reason this kitchen is what it is. I did not just survive here. I built something here." And then Harlan said very quietly without looking up, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For staying," he said, "when you had every reason not to." She held that for a moment. She thought about the 9 rejection notices in the tin box. She thought about Mildred on the platform. She thought about the long train ride west, the cold window against her forehead, the sky changing outside the glass. "I had every reason to stay," she said. "I just had to find out what they were." He looked at her, then that direct, unguarded look, the one she had been seeing more of in the last months, the one that didn't calculate anything. "I'd like to tell you something," he said. "All right. I wrote to that agency because I needed someone to run the household. That was true. That's what I told myself, and I meant it." He looked at the table. "What I didn't tell myself, what I didn't know how to admit, was that I was also very tired of being alone." She was very still. "I'd been alone for 4 years after Margaret died," he said. "Not lonely, I told myself. I was too busy to be lonely. Too much to manage. Too much falling apart to have time for loneliness." He looked at the sign on the wall, Greer's Kitchen, and something in his expression was entirely undefended. But that first night, when you made supper from nothing, when Pete said it was the first warm meal in weeks, I sat at that table and I thought, what has this house been? What have I let it become? She looked at her hands. You didn't let it become anything, she said. You were managing a crisis alone. That's different. Maybe. He was quiet for a moment. But you changed it. Not just the food and the accounts and the management. You changed the way this house felt. He looked at her. You gave it back something I didn't know it had lost. She thought about Pete saying the house felt like a house again. She thought about Danny starting the fire in the mornings, and Arlo sitting in the kitchen in the evenings, and the way the supper table had gradually become something to gather around rather than just a place to eat and leave. I didn't do that alone, she said. They met me halfway. They did, he agreed, because you gave them something to meet. She looked at the sign on the wall. She thought Greer's kitchen. She thought mine, not borrowed, not temporary, not the arrangement that serves its purpose and then makes way. Mine. Dumb. The summer moved on. The kitchen garden came in better than she'd hoped, the potatoes and the onions doing particularly well, the carrots sweet and tender, the cabbage producing strong heads she had been preserving all through July. The herbs along the south wall had spread further than she'd planted them, which she took as a good sign. Everything she had put in the ground, in the cold, in the doubt, in the not yet spring, had come up. In August, Harlan hired the fourth hand, a young man named Walter, from a family down in Colorado, who arrived with a good recommendation and a willingness to learn that made Danny immediately take him under his supervision with the practiced authority of a man who had recently received that gift himself and understood its value. The Double G was not prosperous, not yet. There were still lean months ahead, still debts to manage, still years of rebuilding to do. The north section was sold and gone, and the herd was a quarter of what it had once been, and these were real losses that would take real time. But the house was warm, the men were fed, the books were balanced, the kitchen was alive. And one evening in late August, Cecelia came in from the garden in the long gold light, dirt on her hands, and in her hair, smelling of sun and green things, carrying a basket of early autumn vegetables she'd just brought in the last of the summer squash. The first of the hard cabbage heads, a handful of herbs she'd tie and dry. She set the basket on the kitchen work table and turned to wash her hands, and she found Harlan in the kitchen doorway, watching her. He was not measuring. He was not calculating. He was just watching with an expression that had nothing professional or careful about it, an expression she had seen emerging slowly over the months since the porch steps in May, becoming more present, more sure of itself. You have dirt on your nose, he said. She wiped her nose on her sleeve. Better? No, he said, but it doesn't matter. She looked at him. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, closed the way he had stood in the yard when she was carrying the trunk to leave close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the gray in his hair, in the particular set of his jaw when he was going to say something he had decided to say. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. I'm going to be better at it. I know that too. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out carefully without ceremony and took her rough, calloused hand in his and held it. She looked down at their hands. His were almost as rough as hers. Decades of work, decades of holding things together and losing them anyway and holding them again. She turned her hand over and held his back. They stood in the kitchen for a while like that, just standing, just holding the evening light coming through the window and lying across the floor in a long gold stripe, the sign on the wall reading Greer's Kitchen, in carved letters that wouldn't come down for as long as the house stood. She did not need him to say more. She did not need the fairy tale version of this moment. She was a practical woman, and she understood practical things, and what she understood in this moment was that this man, difficult, private, slow to speak, and slow to feel, but not unwilling, had chosen her. Clearly, finally, with full information, not because she was the only option left, because of who she actually was. September came. The kitchen garden was going into its last good weeks before Frost and Cecelia was out there, every morning in the early light, harvesting and noting and planning for what to preserve and what to let go. She stood at the garden edge one morning in the first week of September, with her hands full of cabbage and the Wyoming sky enormous and blue above her, and the ranch house visible behind her, solid and maintained smoke coming from the kitchen chimney where the range was already going. She had a life, not the life she had imagined when she was young, not the fairy tale, not the romance, not the handsome man who had looked at her twice on a street somewhere. That life had never been offered to her, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago. She had this life, the one she had built with her hands from nothing, in a cold kitchen, in a failing ranch in Wyoming, on the bet that things could be different if she was willing to do the work. She heard him come out the back door, his step, which she knew in all its variations now, and she turned around. He was crossing the yard toward her with a cup of coffee in each hand, wearing his work clothes, squinting a little against the morning light the way he always did. He held out one of the cups. She set down her basket and took it. They stood together in the kitchen garden in the September morning, drinking coffee, looking at what she'd grown. The cabbages, the onion tops, the last of the squash, the herbs that had spread further than planned. "Good year," he said. "Better next year," she said. He glanced at her. That almost smile, which she had come to understand, was for Harlan Greer what a grin was for other men. "Better next year," he agreed. They stood there a while longer. The horses moved in the paddock. From the bunkhouse, she could hear Pete and Danny starting the morning, the sound of voices, adore boots on the step. Arlo would be out to the cattle already. Walter would be with him. The double G was running. She had held it together through the winter when it was falling apart. She had stretched nothing into something and kept the men fed and kept the fires going and built a small economy out of a pantry and a smokehouse and a notebook on a nail. She had done all of it without a single person asking her to, simply because it needed doing. And she was there, and she knew how. She had been chosen last. She had decided that last didn't mean what she'd always believed it meant. The gold light came across the ridge and lay across the garden and across the yard and across the kitchen wall, where the carved sign read Greer's Kitchen, her name on it, not borrowed and not temporary, and she thought, "I found it." Not the something sweet she had talked herself out of hoping for. Not the fairy tale. Not the easy, effortless happiness that some women seem to walk into without knowing what it had cost. Something better. Something that had been earned day by day, meal by meal, winter by winter, in the precise and particular way that real things are always earned by showing up, by staying, by choosing to care for a place and a people, even when no one had asked you to, and even when you weren't sure anyone would notice. Someone had noticed. She had held this place together, and the place had held her back. That was everything. That was more than she had ever been promised. And if this story touched you, if you've ever felt like the last choice, or wondered whether what you offer to the world is enough, I want you to know this channel is for you. Leave a comment below right now and tell me where you're watching from. Every single comment means something to me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now before this video ends. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a story. We're here every single week with new stories of women like Cecelia Plain, practical, undefeated, and worth every word. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.